Okay, now we're moving on to section 6. This is FAR bar as is 5, which is the version revised as of April of 2017. We're moving on to section 6, occupancy and possession. We're just going to read this pretty clear as we read it, but let's just make sure we cover a couple things. Subparagraph A, unless the box in paragraph 6B is checked, seller shall at closing, 6B is here obviously, seller shall at closing deliver occupancy and possession of the property to buyer free of tenants, occupants, and future tenancies. Future tenancies would be future leases that have been signed obligating that owner that were there. So if the seller is planning on doing any of those things, having a tenant stay there, their occupants, or future tenancies, they need to notify you here by checking that box. We'll read that in a second. Also at closing, seller shall have removed all personal items and trash from the property and shall deliver all keys, garage door openers, access devices, and codes as applicable to the buyer. This is a big point. Okay, now the property does not have to be sparkling clean. We always get in, people do final walkthroughs and they think that the house has to be professionally cleaned. It's some people do, some people don't. I always joke when I move that I would always like to buy from me, because when I move, I have it professionally cleaned on my way out the door. Buyers are thrilled, everybody else, and I go to my new house and it's a wreck. So I just wish I could buy for myself. But that being said, this is the only obligation. The seller shall have removed all personal items and trash from the property and shall deliver all keys, garage doors, door openers, access devices, and codes as applicable to the buyer. Here's the deal. Oh, I got a few things I still need to get out of there, but we're going to head to closing. That could be a problem. All right. First of all, the minute you close, everything that's in that property is now property of the buyer. All right, and it's the new owner. So, and who wants somebody wandering back in and doing things, or I'm just going to leave a few things in the garage, or you go to walk through and, oh, we didn't really want these items, so we just left them for your benefit. And it's like, yeah, it's not my benefit. It's trash that I have to get rid of. So if you are representing the buyer and you have stuff in there you don't want still be in there, then you insist per the contract that they get that removed. If not, then you get a hauling company to give you an estimate of what it's going to take to get, and you escrow funds for that amount, or have the seller withhold funds from the closing so that you can pay this person to get that done. All right. If occupancy is to be delivered before closing, now this is a big we have other riders that we're going to see when we start covering the rider to this contract about what is called pre-occupancy by buyer. All right. Highly recommend against this. All right. Just want to know you on the front side. There's so many things that can go wrong when a buyer moves in before closing. In essence, they're renting the property and there really has to be a lease drawn up. Same thing with the seller sticking around after closing. I know there's some other states, I think New York in particular, where it's very common for the seller to stick around after closing. That is highly frowned upon here. I discourage it if at all costs. It would be, of your list of 30 potential options to try and save a deal, having the buyer move in early or the seller remain after closing is number 31 out of 30. The last choice you'd have to come up with. So, but let's continue reading. If occupancy is to be delivered before closing, buyer assumes all risks of loss to the property from the date of occupancy. So that means if their stuff, there's a huge fire and their antique piano burns down, and it was really in the name of the home was still in the name of the previous owner because it hasn't closed yet, you're gonna have issues. That's why we advise against it. But this says that they would assume all risk from the date of occupancy, shall be responsible and liable for maintenance from that date, meaning if the AC breaks after they move in and they're going to close in a week or 2 weeks or whatever, then they're moving that in as if they are the owner. All right, is what that's going to say, and that addendum would say that as well. And shall be deemed to have accepted the property in its existing condition at the time of taking occupancy. Meaning what? Meaning that the day they move in, even if they haven't closed, they are going to take it as is, because from there on out, if the seller would say, okay, well, if something's broken, it's because you broke it or it broke on your watch, so therefore you should be responsible since you moved in early. All right, so that's kind of there. The rider that you would use would also say that there is a lease that should be drawn up to protect all parties and so on. People say, well, I'm going to lease it for 3 days. Really? Yes, I highly recommend you write a lease for just those 3 days. All right. Then let's go to subparagraph B. Check this if the property is subject to lease is or occupancy after closing. If the property is subject to a lease after closing or is intended to be rented or occupied by third parties beyond the closing, the facts and the terms thereof shall be disclosed in writing by seller to the buyer, and copies of the written leases shall be delivered to the buyer, all within 5 days after the effective date. Now, there are some things that when you're buying a triplex, you know that you're assuming leases. There are times when you don't know you may be assuming a lease, but it should be disclosed here. All right. There are times when investors, I myself have purchased properties that had existing tenants, that had existing leases, and the seller, when selling that, cannot, unless they negotiate an early buyout of the lease from the tenant, cannot make the tenant move just because they sold the property. The property is sold subject to the leases that are in place already. So if you're buying that property and you know that there are tenants there, you want to be able to have all that information about the tenant, what their lease is, how long the lease is for, what's the amount, the type of security deposit it has, and so on and so forth. So this says that if it is, then the seller has to provide to the buyer copies of all the leases and everything, all within 5 days after the effective date. If the buyer determined in the buyer's sole discretion that the leases or terms of occupancy are not acceptable to the buyer, then the buyer may terminate this contract by delivery of written notice of such election to seller within 5 days after the receipt of the above items from the seller. So let's say we just go to contract on April 1st. Then by April 6th, I need to have this data from the seller. And then I have until April 11th, okay, 5 days later. Now, if the seller got that to me on the 3rd of April, I would only have 5 days from receiving it. So I'd only have until April 8th to make my election if I'm the buyer, that if I like the lease, I don't like the lease, or there's anything. And it's at the buyer's sole discretion if they are accepting the lease and the tenants there. All right. If they don't, they will deliver a written notice and they give that to the seller, and the buyer shall be refunded the deposit, thereby releasing buyer and seller from further obligations under this contract. Estoppel letters and seller's affidavits shall be provided pursuant to Standard D. We can cover that later. If property is to be occupied by seller after closing, see rider U. That's the post-closing occupancy by the seller. That's the rider that I referenced up here, that there's a rider for pre-occupancy by the buyer and a rider U for the post-closing occupancy by the seller. All right. Estoppel letters, those are letters saying that everything's up to date, that or you'll see that many times in an HOA. It is covered in Standard D. You want to make sure that the seller has paid up all their rightful amounts that they may owe on this property and taking care of things. So, all right. So that will be covered in Standard D. Now, notice the difference. There's a difference in a Standard D. That's in the body of this contract. A rider U, that's letter U. Rider, it's not a university. Rider U is one of the riders or the addenda to this contract that we'll be covering after we get through the contract as well. So it's available on Transaction Desk and Form Simplicity as well. So that is it on occupancy and possession. That's where that would go, and any things that you may come up against or pitfalls reliant in there on Section 6. All right, thanks.